I signed the paperwork selling my father's house while he was still sleeping upstairs. The pen felt steady in my hand, steadier than it had any right to feel, considering I was about to detonate my entire family with a single signature. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 24 hours earlier, I had been standing in that same house, in the kitchen where I learned to bake bread with my grandmother, where I had done homework at the counter while my mother cooked dinner, where every major family conversation of my life had taken place. My father had looked at me across that kitchen island with an expression I had never seen before, something between contempt and satisfaction, and he had said the words that would change everything between us forever. You need to apologize to your sister, or you can get out of this house and not come back until you are ready to be part of this family again. My name is Rebecca Chen, and I am 31 years old. I work as a senior project coordinator for a commercial construction firm in Portland, Oregon, managing timelines and budgets for projects that sometimes run into the tens of millions of dollars. I am good at my job because I am detail-oriented, because I anticipate problems before they become crises, and because I understand that sometimes you have to make difficult decisions quickly before situations spiral beyond control. These skills, which served me so well in my professional life, were about to become essential in ways I never imagined. The confrontation that led to my father's ultimatum had started 3 days earlier at what was supposed to be a celebration dinner for my younger sister Vanessa's engagement. Vanessa, at 27, was getting married to Marcus, a man she had been dating for 8 months. 8 months. I had kept my concerns to myself for most of that time, watching as my sister rushed headlong into yet another relationship with the same patterns I had seen play out 4 times before. Vanessa had a type, and that type was charming, unreliable men who made grand romantic gestures while failing to maintain steady employment or take responsibility for their lives. Marcus fit the pattern perfectly. He was handsome in a way that photographs well on social media, with carefully styled hair and an extensive collection of designer sneakers that he somehow afforded despite working sporadically as a freelance graphic designer. He spoke enthusiastically about his creative projects and his dreams of starting his own agency, but in the 8 months I had known him, I had never seen him complete a project or take a concrete step toward any of his stated goals. He was 34 years old and still living with 2 roommates in an apartment where the living room had been converted into a 3rd bedroom, splitting rent 3 ways because he could never quite save enough for a security deposit on his own place. At the engagement dinner, surrounded by my parents, my Aunt Linda, and my mother's best friend Patricia, who had known Vanessa since she was a baby, I had watched Marcus describe his vision for the wedding. They were thinking destination wedding, maybe Costa Rica or maybe Bali, somewhere tropical and beautiful where everyone could make a vacation out of it. He spoke animatedly about beachside ceremonies and sunset receptions, about hiring a photographer whose Instagram aesthetic he admired, about creating an experience that would be unforgettable for everyone involved. My father had beamed at him, nodding along enthusiastically, already talking about how he could coordinate time off work to spend a week at the destination. My mother had clasped her hands together with delight, her eyes shining with happy tears as she imagined her youngest daughter getting married in paradise. My Aunt Linda was already looking up resorts on her phone, showing my mother options and discussing which locations offered the best combination of beauty and accessibility. I had listened to this planning for 20 minutes before I finally spoke up. The question I asked was simple and, I thought, reasonable. I had turned to Marcus and asked him directly how he planned to contribute financially to this destination wedding he was describing, given that such weddings typically cost significantly more than traditional local ceremonies and required guests to make substantial travel investments. The table had gone quiet. Marcus had looked at me with an expression of confused offense, as though I had asked something inappropriate rather than a practical question about his ability to help pay for his own wedding. Vanessa had immediately jumped to his defense, her voice rising with indignation as she informed me that they were still figuring out the details and that my question was rude and insulting. My mother had gently suggested that perhaps this was not the time or place for such discussions, her tone carrying that familiar note of disappointment that I had disrupted a pleasant moment with my tendency toward negativity. But I had not been able to let it drop. I had spent too many years watching my family enable Vanessa's poor decisions, watching them bail her out financially and emotionally every time one of her relationships imploded, watching them make excuses for her choices while holding me to an entirely different standard. So I had pressed forward, pointing out that Vanessa had credit card debt from her last relationship that she had never paid off, that she was still driving a car my parents had bought her after she totaled her previous vehicle, that she was living in an apartment where my parents paid half the rent, because her job as a social media coordinator for a small marketing agency did not cover her expenses in one of the most expensive cities in the country. I had said, calmly and without raising my voice, that perhaps before planning an elaborate destination wedding, Vanessa and Marcus should focus on building a stable financial foundation together. I had suggested that their guests, many of whom would be expected to spend thousands of dollars on flights and accommodations, might appreciate a more modest local celebration that did not require such a significant investment. I had pointed out that starting a marriage with a realistic budget was generally more successful than starting a marriage with debt from an extravagant wedding neither party could actually afford. Vanessa had stood up from the table so fast her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Her face had flushed red, and her eyes had filled with tears as she accused me of trying to ruin her engagement, of being jealous because I was still single while she had found someone who loved her, of always finding fault with everything she did because I could not stand to see her happy. She had said that I was bitter and controlling, and that I had always treated her like she was incompetent instead of supporting her dreams. Marcus had put his arm around her shoulders protectively, glaring at me like I was some kind of villain who had attacked his fiancée without provocation. My mother had immediately gone to Vanessa's other side, murmuring comforting words and shooting me reproachful looks. My Aunt Linda had excused herself from the table, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating conflict.
Patricia had stared down at her plate, carefully neutral. My father had turned to me with an expression of profound disappointment and said that he owed my sister an apology for embarrassing her at what was supposed to be a celebration of her happiness. He had refused, stating clearly that he had asked legitimate questions and expressed reasonable concerns, and that he would not apologize for being the only person at the table willing to acknowledge reality. The dinner had ended shortly after, with Vanessa leaving in tears, Marcus following her out with a final accusatory look in my direction, and my parents making it clear through their body language and clipped responses that he had committed some unforgivable transgression. For 3 days after that dinner, he had received a barrage of text messages and phone calls. Vanessa had sent me long paragraphs about how hurt she was, how she had always looked up to me and could not understand why he was being so cruel to her now when she needed my support. My mother had called twice to tell me that he needed to make this right, that Vanessa was heartbroken and that family was supposed to support each other during important life moments, not tear each other down. My Aunt Linda had sent a carefully worded message suggesting that perhaps he could have chosen a better team to voice my concerns and that it might be worth apologizing just to keep the peace. He had not responded to any of them. He had gone to work, managed my projects, met with contractors and clients, and tried to process what had happened. The more he talked about it, the angrier he became. Not the hot, explosive anger that burns bright and fast, but the cold, clarifying anger that settles into your bones and makes you see patterns you had been trying to ignore. He had been the responsible one my entire life. While Vanessa was the creative one, the free spirit, the baby of the family who needed extra support and understanding, he was the one who was expected to have everything figured out. He had paid for my own college education through a combination of scholarships, part-time jobs, and the student loans that he had spent years paying off. Vanessa had dropped out of college after 3 semesters, deciding that formal education was stifling her creativity, and my parents had told me he should be more understanding of her different past. He had bought my own car, my own furniture, my own everything, while Vanessa received financial support from my parents well into her 20s because she was still finding herself. When he had gotten my first promotion at work and wanted to celebrate, my parents had been cordial but distracted, offering brief congratulations before changing the subject. When Vanessa had gotten her job at the marketing agency, a position that paid $35,000 a year and offered minimal benefits, my parents had thrown a dinner party and invited extended family to celebrate her success. When he had finally paid off my student loans after 7 years of aggressive payments, sacrificing vacations and luxuries to become debt-free, my parents had said that Wesley Santen asked if he could loan Vanessa money to cover her rent that month. The pattern had been there my entire life, but I told myself it was fine, that I was strong enough not to need the same level of support Vanessa required, that being self-sufficient was its own reward. But watching my family rally around Vanessa's engagement to a man who had no realistic plan for supporting himself let alone a wife, watching them plan an expensive destination wedding that would inevitably require their financial assistance, watching them demand that I apologize for starting obvious truths, something inside me had finally broken. On the third day after the engagement dinner, I had driven to my parents' house to pick up some tools I had stored in their garage. My father had been home alone, and had met me at the door with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that expression of patriarchal authority that had defined so many of our interactions over the years. "We need to talk," he had said, gesturing for me to come inside. I had followed him into the kitchen, that familiar space where so many family moments had unfolded. He had not offered me coffee or asked me to sit down. Instead, he had stood on the opposite side of the kitchen island, creating a physical barrier between us that felt symbolic of something larger. "Your sister is devastated, Rebecca. She has been crying for 3 days because her own sister tried to humiliate her in front of her fiancé and our family. Your mother is upset. I am upset. This is not how our family operates." I had listened to him speak, noting the way he framed the situation. Vanessa was devastated, as though she were the victim of an unprovoked attack. My mother was upset, as though her feelings took precedence over truth or reality. I was upset, which apparently was reason enough for me to change my behavior. But nowhere in his speech did he acknowledge that my concerns might be valid or that asking questions about financial planning before a wedding was reasonable or that Vanessa's pattern of financial irresponsibility might be worth addressing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I asked legitimate questions, I had said calmly. I expressed concerns that anyone who cares about Vanessa should have. If pointing out that she and Marcus have no realistic plan for paying for this wedding is humiliating, then maybe the problem is not my questions but their lack of answers. My father's expression had hardened further. "You were out of line. Marcus is a good man who loves your sister, and they deserve to celebrate their engagement without you running negativity on their plans. Just because you have chosen to prioritize career over relationships does not give you the right to judge people who have different priorities." The comment about prioritizing career over relationships had landed like I intended it to, a subtle dig at my single status, the implication that my professional success was somehow compensation for personal failure. I had felt the familiar twist in my stomach that came with these kinds of conversations, the feeling of being simultaneously criticized for being too much and not enough. "Vanessa needs support right now, not criticism," my father had continued. "She is planning the most important day of her life, and she needs her family to be happy for her. You are going to apologize to her and to Marcus for your behavior at dinner, and you are going to support their wedding plans going forward. That is what family does." I had looked at my father, really looked at him, and he had seen something he had been avoiding seeing for years. He had seen a man who had decided long ago which daughter deserved his unconditional support and which daughter was strong enough to make do without it. He had seen a man who would rather demand that I silence my concerns than address the legitimate issues those concerns highlighted. He had seen a man who believed that family harmony meant everyone agreeing with him and accommodating dysfunction rather than acknowledging it. "And if he do not apologize," he had asked quietly, "what then?" My father had not hesitated. "Then you can leave this house and not come back until you are ready to be part of this family. I am not going to have you disrupting Vanessa's happiness or causing problems between her and Marcus. You make your choice, Rebecca. Apologize and be part of this family, or live and deal with the consequences of your stubbornness." I had stood there in that kitchen, the kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to knead dough, where I had studied for my licensing exams, where I had celebrated every milestone that my parents had deemed worthy of acknowledgement. I had talked about all the times he had apologized when he should not have, all the times he had swallowed my concerns to keep the peace, all the times he had made himself smaller so that Vanessa could feel bigger. and he had said, clearly and without emotion, all right. My father had looked momentarily surprised, as though he had expected more resistance. He had nodded, seeming satisfied that his ultimatum had worked. Good. I am glad you are being reasonable about this. Your mother and I will set up a lunch this weekend where you can apologize to Vanessa and Marcus properly, and then we can all move forward. But he had not meant all right as in he agreed to your terms. He had meant all right as in hear what you are saying, and now I am going to respond in a way you did not anticipate. He had turned and walked out of the house without another word, gotten into my car, and driven away. That night, he had sat in my apartment and talked about something he had been avoiding thinking about for months. My parents' house, the house where he had grown up, the house my father was using as leverage to control my behavior, was not actually in his name anymore. It was in my name. Had been for 8 months. The previous winter, my father had come to me with a problem. He was 63 years old and thinking about retirement in a few years. He had significant credit card debt from various home improvements and medical expenses that were not fully covered by insurance. The debt was affecting his credit score, which was affecting the interest rates on that debt, creating a spiral that was making it increasingly difficult to manage. He had asked if he would be willing to help him refinance his mortgage at a better rate, which would require me to co-sign on the loan given his compromised credit. He had met with him and my mother to discuss the situation. The house was worth approximately $450,000. They owed about $200,000 on the existing mortgage. They wanted to refinance that mortgage and take out additional equity to pay off the credit card debt and do some necessary repairs to the roof and back system. The total new mortgage would be about $280,000. He had reviewed their finances carefully. My father made about $70,000 a year as a facilities manager for a school district. My mother made about $40,000 as a part-time administrative assistant. They had minimal retirement savings because they had spent much of their disposable income over the years supporting Vanessa through various crises and funding her lifestyle. Their monthly expenses were big, including the money they gave Vanessa regularly, the car payment on the vehicle they had bought for her, and their portion of her rent. The mortgage broker had been frank with me during our consultation. Given my parents' debt-to-income ratio and credit score, they would not qualify for refinancing at a favorable rate even with a co-signer. However, if he were to become the primary borrower and put my parents on the title as co-owners, my excellent credit and stable income would qualify us for a much better rate. The monthly payment would be about $1,800, which my parents could afford if they tightened their budget, and it would be added to the title as the primary owner with them as secondary owners. My father had assured me this was just a formality to get better rates, that the house would still be theirs in every meaningful sense, that it was just helping them access better terms. My mother had emphasized that they would make every payment on time and that he would never have to worry about being responsible for anything. They had both promised that this was a temporary arrangement just to get them through a difficult period, and once they paid down some debt and improved their credit, they could refinance again in a few years and take my name off the title. He had consulted with a real estate attorney before agreeing to anything. The attorney had explained very clearly what he would be agreeing to. He would be the primary owner of the property. My parents would have secondary ownership rights, but he would have the legal authority to make decisions about the property, including the right to sell it if necessary. He would be fully liable for the mortgage if my parents failed to pay, meaning the lender could come after my assets and ruin my credit if payments were missed. He would essentially be the owner in every legal sense, with my parents as co-owners who had the right to live there but not the right to make unilateral decisions about the property. The attorney had asked me directly if he trusted my parents to make the payments as promised and whether he was comfortable taking on this level of risk and responsibility. He had talked about it carefully. My parents had always paid their bills, even if they had accumulated debt doing so. They had never defaulted on their mortgage in the 35 years they had owned the house. And despite our differences in how we approach family dynamics, I believed they were fundamentally responsible people who would honor their commitments to me. So I agreed. I had signed the papers making me the primary owner of my childhood home. I had taken on a mortgage that appeared on my credit report and affected my debt-to-income ratio. I had done this because they were my parents and they needed help and I had the financial stability to provide that help. My father had shaken my hand and thanked me, calling me a lifesaver. My mother had hugged me and said I was such a good daughter. Vanessa had not been informed of the arrangement because, as my parents explained, she did not need to worry about these kinds of financial details. For 8 months, my parents had made the payments on time. I had checked my mortgage account regularly to confirm the payments were being processed and everything had been fine. I had not talked much about the legal implications of being the primary owner. It had felt like a technicality, a means to an end, a way to help my parents access better interest rates. The house still felt like their house, the place where they lived and where family gatherings happened and where Vanessa stored her childhood belongings in her old bedroom. But sitting in my apartment after my father's ultimatum, I had pulled out the paperwork from that refinancing. I had read through the legal documents carefully, paying attention to sections I had skimmed before. I had confirmed what I already knew but had not fully internalized. I was the primary owner. I had the legal right to sell the property. My parents were co-owners with the right to live there, but I did not need their permission to list the house or to accept an offer on it. I had spent that entire night thinking about what this meant and what I could do with this information. My father had used the house as leverage against me, threatening to exclude me from the family home if he did not apologize for behavior that did not warrant an apology. He had weaponized the space where I had grown up, the space that held my memories and my history, using it as a bargaining chip to force my compliance. He had done this while standing in a house that was legally mine, making threats about property he no longer controlled. The anger he felt was not hot or impulsive. It was cold and methodical and absolutely clear. My father had established the terms. He had said he could leave the house and not come back until he was ready to be part of the family on his terms. He had created a situation where my access to family spaces was conditional on my willingness to accommodate dysfunction and enable bad decisions. He had made it clear that my boundaries, my concerns, and my perspective were less important than maintaining the illusion that everything was fine. So I had decided to accept his terms in a way I had not anticipated. If he wanted me out of the house until he was ready to apologize, then he would leave. And he would take the house with me. I had contacted a real estate agent first thing the next morning. Her name was Diana Torres, and she specialized in quick sales in the Portland metro area. I had explained my situation in broad terms without going into family drama. I owned a property that I needed to sell quickly, preferably within 30 days, and I was willing to price it competitively to ensure a fast sale. Diana had come to evaluate the property that same afternoon while my parents were both at work. She had walked through the house, taken measurements and photographs, assessed the condition of the roof and the back system and all the recent improvements my parents had made with their financed equity. The house is in excellent condition, Diana told me as we sat in her car reviewing camps in the neighborhood. Given the location and the recent updates, I think we can list this at $475,000 and likely get offers at or above asking within a week. If you are willing to accept $450,000, I can probably have this sold in 72 hours. There is a lot of demand in this neighborhood and inventory estate. I had done the math quickly in my head. The outstanding mortgage was about $275,000 after 8 months of payments. Selling at $450,000 would net approximately $175,000 after closing costs and agent commissions. That money would be divided according to the ownership structure, with me as primary owner receiving the majority and my parents as secondary owners receiving their portion based on their equity stack. I had told Diana to list it at $450,000 with the goal of selling within the week. She had created the listing that evening, and it had gone live on the multiple listing service the following morning at 9 a.m. By noon, she had called total mess. She had received 3 offers, all above asking price, all cash, all willing to close within 3 weeks. He had reviewed the offers and accepted the strongest one. $475,000, cash, 15-day close, no inspection contingency beyond what was legally required. The buyers were investors who planned to rent the property out and were willing to move quickly and accommodated a slightly expedited timeline. He had signed the purchase agreement electronically at 2 p.m. while sitting at my desk at work, in between conference calls about a commercial project in Beaverton. That evening, he had driven to my parents' house one final time. It was 7 p.m., and he knew both of them would be home. He had parked in the driveway and walked up to the front door with a folder containing copies of all the relevant documents. My hands had been steady as he rang the doorbell, which he had never done before in my life because he had always just walked in like it was my home too. My mother had answered the door, looking surprised to see me. "Rebecca," she had said, her voice uncertain. "We were not expecting you. Have you come to talk to your father about apologizing to Vanessa?" He had walked past her into the living room without answering. My father had been sitting on the couch watching the news, and had looked up with that same expression of patriarchal authority he had worn in the kitchen 2 days earlier. He had not stood up or turned off the television, which was his way of indicating that he was interrupting his evening and should make this quick. He had stood in the center of the living room, the room where he had opened Christmas presents and played board games and watched movies with my family for decades. He had looked at my parents and he had said, very calmly and clearly, "I have accepted your terms. You told me to leave this house and not come back, so I am leaving. And since this house is in my name, I have sold it. You have 15 days before closing, which means you need to find somewhere else to live by the end of the month." The silence that followed was absolute. My mother had frozen in the doorway, her hand still on the doorknob. My father had stared at me like he had spoken in a language I did not understand. For several seconds, neither of them moved or spoke, and he had simply stood there holding my folder full of documents, waiting for them to process what he had said. Then my father had exploded from the couch, his face flushing red, his voice rising to a volume he had rarely heard from him. "What the hell are you talking about? You sold our house? You cannot sell your house. This is our home." He had opened the folder and pulled out copies of the refinancing documents, the ones they had signed 8 months ago, the ones that made me the primary owner. He had held them up so they could see the highlighted sections. "I am the primary owner of this property as of last March when we refinanced. You signed documents giving me that authority because it was the only way to get the interest rate you needed. I have the legal right to sell this house, and I have exercised that right. I accepted an offer this afternoon. The closing is scheduled for 3 weeks from yesterday." My mother had moved into the room then, walking to my father's side, her face pale. "Rebecca, this is insane. You cannot be serious. This is our home. This is where we live. You cannot just sell your house out from under us. You have lived here rent-free for 8 months while I paid the mortgage," he had said, my voice still calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "You made the monthly payments as we agreed, but that mortgage is in my name and affects my credit and my financial profile. I have been responsible for this property since last March. And 2 days ago, that made it clear that my access to this property was conditional on my willingness to apologize for behavior that does not warrant an apology. It told me to leave and not come back. So I am accepting those terms." My father's face had gone from red to almost purple. "You are doing this because I told you to apologize to your sister? You are destroying our lives over a disagreement about Vanessa's wedding?" He had felt something click into place then, a clarity he had not quite achieved until he heard him say those words. He had looked at him directly and said, "I am not destroying your lives. I am responding appropriately to the position you put me in. You set this house as leverage against me. You threatened to exclude me from family spaces unless I complied with your demands. You did this while standing in a house that you do not own. You created this situation, and I am simply working within the parameters you established. My mother had started crying then, not the gentle tears she cried at emotional moments but loud, panicked sobs. Where are we supposed to go? We cannot afford to rent a place on our income. You know we cannot qualify for another mortgage. How can you do this to us? We are your parents. The question my mother had asked in the air between us, heavy with exhaustion and disbelief. How could I do this to them? The question assumed that he was the aggressor, that he had initiated this conflict, that he was taking some kind of revenge that was disproportionate to the offense. But standing in that living room, looking at my parents' shocked faces, I understood with absolute clarity that this moment had been building for 31 years. This was not about a single conversation or a single ultimatum. This was about a lifetime of patterns that had finally reached their inevitable conclusion. My childhood had been defined by a very clear division of expectations. From the time I was old enough to understand family dynamics, it had been obvious that Vanessa and I occupied different roles in our parents' imagination of what their daughter should be. I was born first, arriving on a cold November morning in 1993 at Providence Portland Medical Center after 14 hours of labor that my mother still occasionally referenced as proof of my stubborn nature. Vanessa arrived 4 years later, an easy birth that my mother described as smooth and uncomplicated, which seemed to set the tone for how my parents would view both of us going forward. As the older sister, I had been given responsibilities early. I was expected to help with household chores as soon as I was old enough to hold a dust rag. I learned to load the dishwasher properly by age 6, to sort laundry by color and fabric type by age 7, to help prepare simple meals by age 8. These were not optional contributions but required participation in the functioning of our household. My parents had explained that everyone needed to do their part, that being part of a family meant contributing to the collective welfare, that learning responsibility young would serve me well in life. Vanessa, on the other hand, had been treated as though childhood was something to be preserved and protected for as long as possible. When she was 6 and I was 10, I was setting the table for dinner every night while she was allowed to continue playing until the food was ready. When she was 8 and I was 12, I was doing my own laundry while my mother still washed and folded Vanessa's clothes because she was not quite ready for that responsibility yet. When she was 12 and I was 16, I had a part-time job at a local grocery store bagging groceries and saving money for college while Vanessa received an allowance for completing basic chores that I had been doing without compensation for years. The justifications had always been about our different personalities and needs. I was naturally organized and responsible, my parents said, so these tasks came easily to me. Vanessa was more creative and free-spirited, which meant she needed more time to develop practical skills at her own pace. I was academically inclined and self-motivated, so I did not need as much parental attention to stay on track with schoolwork. Vanessa struggled with focus and needed more support and encouragement to complete assignments and prepare for tests. What my parents had framed as accommodating different temperaments, I had eventually recognized as creating fundamentally different standards for what was acceptable behavior and achievement. When I brought home a report card with all grades except for 1B+ in chemistry, my father had asked why I had not worked harder in that class and what my plan was for improving that grade. When Vanessa brought home a report card with mostly C grades and 1B, my parents had celebrated the B and told her they were proud of her improvement. When I was late coming home from a friend's house by 15 minutes due to unexpected traffic, I had been grounded for a week for not calling to update them on my whereabouts. When Vanessa missed her curfew by 2 hours in school and offered a vague excuse about losing track of time, my parents had told her to be more mindful next time and left it at that. The pattern had continued and intensified as we moved into young adulthood. I had chosen to attend Portland State University specifically because it was affordable and would allow me to live at home and save money on room and board. I had worked 25 hours a week at a campus bookstore while carrying a full course load, studying business administration with a focus on project management. He had taken out minimal student loans to cover tuition that my partial academic scholarship did not address, and he had been meticulous about budgeting and tracking every expense. My social life had been limited because I simply did not have a time for extensive socializing between work and school and studying. He had dated occasionally but had never been in a serious relationship during college because he had been focused on building a foundation for my future. Vanessa had enrolled at Oregon State University in Corvallis, about 80 miles south of Portland, because she wanted the full college experience of living on campus and being part of a university community. My parents had paid for her dorm room, her meal plan, her textbooks, and given her a monthly allowance for personal expenses. She had majored in communications with a focus on media studies, a program she had chosen because it seemed interesting and creative without much consideration for what kind of career it might lead to. She had joined a sorority, attended social events regularly, and dated a series of young men whom my parents had met during family weekend visits and pronounced charming. After 3 semesters, Vanessa had decided that college was not the right path for her. She had found the academic work tedious and uninspiring, she had said. She felt constrained by the structure of assignments and deadlines. She wanted to explore other options for building a life that felt authentic to who she was rather than following a conventional path just because it was expected. My parents had been disappointed but supportive, telling her that not everyone was meant for traditional education and that it was better to recognize that early rather than wasting years pursuing something that did not feel right. I had graduated with my bachelor's degree in 4 years, finishing with a 3.7 grade point average and multiple job offers from companies that recruited on campus. I had chosen a position with a mid-sized construction management firm that offered good benefits and opportunities for advancement. He had started at $42,000 a year, which had felt like an enormous amount of money after years of scraping by on part-time wages. He had moved into a small studio apartment in Southeast Portland, furnished it with items from IKEA and Goodwill, and had begun the process of paying down my student loans aggressively while building my career. At my college graduation, my parents had attended the ceremony and taken me out to dinner afterward at a moderately priced Italian restaurant. They had been proud, they had said, though my father had also mentioned that now he would need to start thinking about saving for retirement and building equity rather than spending money on non-essentials. The celebration had lasted about 3 hours total before everyone had gone home. When Vanessa had gotten her job at the marketing agency 2 years later, a position she had obtained through a friend of a friend rather than through any formal application process, my parents had thrown a party at their house. They had invited aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, and neighbors. They had gathered food from Vanessa's favorite Thai restaurant. They had created a slideshow of photos chronicling Vanessa's journey from childhood through her various explorations and adventures to this moment of professional achievement. They had given speeches about how proud they were that she had found her path and was building a career that aligned with her creative spirit. He had attended that party and had smiled and congratulated my sister and had not said anything about the disparity in how our achievements were celebrated. He had told himself that it did not matter, that he did not need external validation, that being self-sufficient was its own reward. But the pattern had continued in was large and small for years. When he had bought my first car, a Honda Civic with sig mileage but good maintenance records, my parents had warned me to be careful about ongoing repair costs and to make sure he was budgeting appropriately for maintenance. When Vanessa had totaled her car by rear-ending someone while texting at a stoplight, my parents had bought her a newer Toyota Corolla and had increased her car insurance premium, which they paid, without comment about her responsibility for the accident. When he had been promoted to project coordinator after 2 years with my company, my parents had said that was Nissan asked if the promotion came with a significant salary increase. When Vanessa had been given a minor title change at her agency from assistant coordinator to coordinator without any change in her actual responsibilities or compensation, my parents had posted about it on Facebook and told everyone they knew about her advancement. When he had needed to have my wisdom teeth removed and the procedure was only partially covered by my dental insurance, leaving me with an $800 bill, he had paid it out of my savings and had not mentioned it to my parents. When Vanessa had needed the same procedure, my parents had paid the uncovered portion and had also given her money to buy soft foods and take a week of work to recover, even though her agency offered paid sick leave. The financial support my parents provided to Vanessa had been extensive and ongoing. Beyond the car and the rent assistance and the frequent loans that were never repaid, they had paid for her to take a photography class when she thought she might want to pursue that professionally. They had bought her a high-end camera and editing software. They had funded a trip to Thailand that she had said was essential for her creative development and her spiritual growth. They had covered her credit card debt when she overspent furnishing her apartment according to an aesthetics she had seen on Instagram. They had paid for her to see a therapist weekly when she went through a difficult breakup, even though that therapy was not covered by her insurance. Each time he had become aware of another instance of financial support, he had felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Part of me had been genuinely glad that my sister had parents who were willing and able to help her when she needed it. Part of me had been frustrated that she seemed to need help constantly because she made choices without considering their financial implications. And part of me had been hurt that my parents had never offered me that same level of support, even in situations where I could have genuinely used help, because they assumed I could handle everything on my own. The assumption of my capability had functioned as a kind of punishment for being responsible. Because I had always figured things out, because I had always managed to solve my own problems, because I had never asked for help or admitted when I was struggling, my parents had concluded that I did not need their support. They had taken my strengths as evidence that I did not require the same care and attention they lavished on Vanessa. They had never seemed to consider that perhaps I was capable because I had no other choice, or that their support might have made my path easier even if I was able to walk it without them. By the time I reached my late 20s, I had built a life that was stable and successful by most external measures. He had been promoted twice more and was now a senior project coordinator earning $78,000 a year. He had moved into an one-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District with 6 ceilings and large windows that filled the space with natural light. He had paid off my student loans completely. He had started contributing to my retirement accounts and had built up a 6-month emergency fund in my savings account. He had cultivated a small group of close friends, mostly colleagues from work and a few people he had met through a recreational volleyball league he had joined. My romantic life had been less successful, though he was not entirely sure why. He had dated periodically throughout my 20s, using apps and meeting people through friends and occasionally connecting with someone at a social event. He had several relationships that lasted a few months before fizzling out, usually because the person he was seeing wanted more time and attention than he felt able to provide given my work commitments, or because we simply did not connect deeply enough to sustain long-term interest. He had one relationship that lasted almost a year with a software engineer named David who he had genuinely cared about and thought might be a lasting partnership. But David had eventually told me that I felt like I was always competing with my work for my attention, that he was so focused on my career and my independence that he did not seem to have a space in my life for building something with another person. That breakup had been painful, not just because I had lost someone he cared about but because his criticism had felt uncomfortably accurate. He was focused on my career and my independence. He had built my entire adult identity around being self-sufficient and professionally successful because those were the only things that had ever earned me recognition or respect. He had learned early that personal happiness or relationship success did not garner the same acknowledgement that professional achievement did, so he had invested my energy where it seemed to generate returns. Vanessa, meanwhile, had moved through a series of relationships with the kind of intensity and drama that characterized everything she did. She fell in love quickly and completely, diving into relationships with men she had known for weeks and moving in with them after months. She talked about soulmates and destiny and finding her person. Each relationship seemed like the definitive one until it ended badly, usually because the man in question turned out to be unemployed or unfaithful or emotionally unavailable in ways that became apparent only after Vanessa had already entangled her life with his. There had been Tyler, the musician who had been recording an album for the entire 2 years they dated and who had borrowed money from Vanessa repeatedly to fund the studio team and equipment that never seemed to result in any finished music.
There had been Josh, the personal trainer who had been charming and attentive until Vanessa discovered he was also dating 3 other women simultaneously. There had been Derek, who had seemed stable and employed until Vanessa learned he was living off money his parents sent him and had no actual job despite claiming to be in real estate. There had been Cameron, who had proposed after 4 months of dating and then had disappeared without explanation 3 weeks before their planned wedding, leaving Vanessa to cancel all the arrangements they had made. After each of these relationships ended, my parents had provided emotional and financial support through the fallout. They had helped Vanessa move out of shared apartments, had covered deposits on new places when she needed to find her own housing quickly, had paid for therapy and self-care retreats and whatever else Vanessa needed to process her heartbreak and rebuild her sense of self. They had never once suggested that perhaps the pattern of choosing unstable men was something Vanessa should examine, or that maybe she should take time to be single and work on herself before jumping into the next relationship. When Vanessa had met Marcus 8 months ago, I had hoped that perhaps this time would be different. He had seemed more mature than her previous boyfriends, more established in his life. He had his own apartment even if he shared it with roommates. He had a career even if it was freelance and sporadic. He talked about his goals and his plans in ways that suggested he thought about the future. But as I had gotten to know him better through family gatherings and the occasional double date that Vanessa had tried to arrange to help me meet someone, I had recognized the same fundamental patterns that had defined all of her previous relationships. Marcus was charming and enthusiastic about things that required no follow-through. He talked constantly about projects he was going to start and opportunities he was pursuing and visions he had for building something meaningful. But he never actually completed anything. He would get excited about a potential client and spend weeks discussing the amazing work they were going to do together, and then nothing would materialize. He would talk about saving money for his own place, but then he would buy expensive sneakers or upgrade his phone or take a spontaneous weekend trip to Seattle. He would describe his plans for growing his freelance work into a full agency, but he would spend his days playing video games or scrolling through social media rather than actually doing outreach or developing his skills. I had watched Vanessa fall into the familiar pattern of supporting him financially and emotionally, of making excuses for his lack of productivity, of believing that this time would be different because he loved her, and they were building something together. I had watched my parents welcome Marcus into the family with the same uncritical enthusiasm they had shown for all of Vanessa's previous partners, choosing to focus on his charm and his expressed intentions rather than on his track record of following through on nothing. The engagement had happened suddenly. Marcus had proposed at a seafood restaurant on the waterfront, getting down on one knee in front of the other diners and presenting Vanessa with a ring that looked expensive but that I suspected was financed and would be paid off slowly if at all. Vanessa had said yes immediately, tearfully, joyfully. She had called my parents from the restaurant to share the news, and they had been thrilled. By the time I heard about the engagement the next day, my parents had already started talking about wedding plans and how exciting it would be to watch their youngest daughter get married. I had tried to be happy for Vanessa. I had tried to focus on her joy rather than on my concerns about whether this relationship had the foundation to sustain a marriage. But I could not shake the feeling that I was watching another iteration of a pattern that had never worked out well, and that this time the consequences would be more significant because marriage was harder to exit than dating or cohabitation. So when the engagement dinner had happened and Marcus had started describing elaborate destination wedding plans without any apparent consideration for how those plans would be funded, I had spoken up. I had asked the questions that needed to be asked. I had pointed out the realities that everyone else seemed content to ignore. And I had been made into the villain of the story for refusing to pretend that everything was fine. Standing in my parents' living room after informing them that I had sold their house, I thought about all of these years of accumulated patterns. I thought about the countless times I had been expected to absorb disappointment and disrespect because I was strong enough to handle it. I thought about the lifetime of being held to higher standards while watching Vanessa be excused from any standards at all. I thought about being told that my concerns were not valid, that my boundaries were not reasonable, that my perspective was not important. My father had recovered from his initial shock enough to begin formulating arguments. "Rebecca, you need to stop this right now. Call the buyers and tell them you have changed your mind. Tell them there was a misunderstanding and the property is not actually for sale. We can fix this if you act quickly." I shook my head calmly. I signed a legally binding purchase agreement. The buyers have already initiated their financing and scheduled their closing. I am not calling them. The sale is moving forward. My mother was still crying, but her tears had shifted from panic to anger. How could you even think about doing this? After everything we have done for you. After we raised you and gave you a home and supported you your entire life. This is how you repay us? The question of repayment hung in the air, laden with assumptions about debt and obligation. I looked at my mother and said something I had never said to her before. What exactly have you done for me? You paid for the basics of childhood that parents are obligated to provide. You gave me a home and food and clothing. But beyond that, what support did you actually offer? I paid for my own college. I bought my own car. I funded my own life entirely from the time I was 18 years old. Meanwhile, you have spent tens of thousands of dollars supporting Vanessa through every crisis she creates. So if we are talking about repayment, let me be clear. I do not owe you anything. The only financial relationship we have now is the mortgage on this house that I have been responsible for since you needed my help to refinance. My father's face had gone from purple back to red, a dangerous color that suggested he was beyond reason. You are being vindictive and spiteful because I asked you to apologize to your sister. You are destroying our lives over a disagreement about her wedding. Do you have any idea how unhinged that is? I met his eyes directly and spoke in the same calm tone I used in difficult meetings at work when contractors tried to intimidate me or clients attempted to change terms midstream. I am not being vindictive. I am responding to the parameters you established. You told me that my access to this house was conditional on my willingness to apologize for behavior that I believe was appropriate and necessary. You used your home as leverage to try to control my actions. The problem is that this has not been your home since last March when you signed it over to me to access better refinancing terms. You tried to use something as a weapon that you do not actually control. That was a strategic error on your part. I pulled out additional documents from my folder and set them on the coffee table. These are the closing documents showing the sale price and timeline. You have 15 days to vacate the property. The buyers have agreed to do a walkthrough inspection this week, so you will need to allow access for that. I suggest you start packing and looking for a new place to live immediately because rental market in Portland is competitive, and finding something appropriate on short notice will be challenging. My mother had moved past crying into a kind of frantic energy. She began pacing the room, wringing her hands, talking rapidly. We cannot find a place in 15 days. Do you know how long it takes to find an apartment? We need to fill out applications and go through approval processes and come up with deposits. We need time. You have to give us more time. The closing date is set. I am not changing it. You have known since March that this house was in my name. You have known that your continued residence here was dependent on maintaining good relationships with me. You chose to leverage that residence against me to force compliance with your demands. These are the consequences of that choice. My father stood up fully now, his body language aggressive. He moved closer to me, and I held my ground even though part of me wanted to step back. You cannot do this. I will not let you do this. I will get a lawyer. I will fight this sale. You cannot just kick your parents out of their home. And I will. And if you try to fight the sale, you will lose. I have spoken with a real estate attorney. The refinancing documents are clear and legally binding. I am the primary owner with full authority to sell. You are secondary owners with right of occupancy, but not with authority to prevent a sale by the primary owner. If you attempt to interfere with the sale, you will be in violation of the purchase agreement and could be held liable for damages. I suggest you accept reality and focus on finding a new place to live rather than wasting money on legal fees for a case you cannot win. The room went silent again. My parents stared at me like I was someone they did not recognize, which was perhaps accurate. They had never seen this version of me before, the version that set boundaries and enforced consequences and refused to be manipulated or controlled. They had only known the version of me that accommodated and absorbed and made things easier for everyone else. I placed the folder of documents on the coffee table and turned toward the door. I will email you the contact information for the buyer's agent and the title company handling the closing. If you have questions about the process, you can direct them to those parties. I will not be involved in the logistics beyond signing the final paperwork. My mother called after me as I reached the door, her voice breaking. Rebecca, please. You cannot do this. We are your family. I turned back to look at them both one final time. You told me I was not part of this family unless I apologized for behavior that did not warrant an apology. You made family membership conditional on my willingness to enable dysfunction and ignore reality. So I am accepting those terms. I am not part of this family anymore. And neither of you are part of my life going forward. I walked out of the house, got into my car and drove away without looking back. The drive back to my apartment took 23 minutes through evening traffic on Interstate 84, but I barely registered the journey. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my breathing was calm and measured, but my mind was moving at extraordinary speed, processing what I had just done and what would come next. I had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. I had taken an action that would permanently alter my relationship with my parents and likely with my sister and potentially with extended family members who would inevitably be drawn into this conflict. The magnitude of what I had set in motion was beginning to sink in, not as regret but as a kind of crystalline awareness that my life had just fundamentally changed direction. When I arrived at my apartment building, I parked in my assigned spot and sat in the car for several minutes before getting out. The building was a modern structure in the Pearl District with clean lines and large windows, the kind of place I had worked years to afford. I had moved here 2 years earlier when my salary had increased enough to justify the higher rent, and I had taken genuine pride in having a space that reflected the life I had built through my own efforts. The apartment had hardwood floors and granite countertops, and a small balcony that overlooked the city. It was mine in a way that nothing else had ever been mine, purchased with money I had earned and maintained through my own discipline and responsibility. I took the elevator to the 4th floor and let myself into the apartment, setting my keys in the bowl by the door and my bag on the bench in the entryway. The space was quiet and orderly, everything in its place because I had always been someone who found comfort in organization and structure. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, drinking it slowly while standing at the counter and looking out the window at the city lights beginning to emerge in the deepening dusk. My phone, which I had silenced during the drive home, was vibrating constantly in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a cascade of notifications. 7 missed calls from my mother. 4 missed calls from my father. 11 text messages from my mother ranging from pleading to angry to desperate. 3 text messages from my father that I could see previews of even without opening them, each one more threatening than the last. 2 missed calls from Vanessa, which surprised me because I had not expected the news to reach her quite this quickly, and 5 text messages from her that the previews indicated were furious and accusatory. I set the phone face down on the counter without reading the full messages or listening to the voicemails. I would need to address these communications eventually, but not tonight. Tonight I needed space to think clearly about what I had done and why I had done it and what principles I was operating from that would guide my decisions going forward. I had spent my entire adult life being reactive to my family's dynamics, accommodating their expectations and absorbing their dysfunction, because that was the role I had been assigned and had accepted. But what I had done tonight was fundamentally different. Selling the house was not a reaction but a strategic action based on a clear assessment of the situation, and a deliberate choice about what I was and was not willing to accept. I had not acted impulsively or emotionally, despite how it might appear to my parents. I had acted with clarity and purpose, using the legal authority I possessed to establish boundaries that could not be violated or ignored. The question that kept circulating in my mind was whether this action was justified or whether I had taken something too far, crossed some line that separated appropriate boundary setting from vindictive retaliation. I sat down at my small dining table with a notebook and pen, a practice I had developed years ago when facing difficult decisions. Writing helped me think more clearly, helped me articulate what I believed, and why I believed it in ways that were sometimes obscured when thoughts stayed internal and unexamined. I wrote at the top of the page in clear block letters, "Was selling the house justified?" Then I drew a line down the center of the page and labeled one column reasons for, and the other column reasons against. Under reasons for, I began listing the factors that supported my decision. The house was legally mine as the primary owner, giving me the authority to sell it. My parents had used the house as leverage to try to control my behavior by threatening to exclude me from family spaces, unless I complied with their demands. They had demonstrated through decades of behavior that they did not respect my boundaries or value my perspective equally to Vanessa's. They had benefited financially from my assistance in refinancing, while continuing to provide substantial financial support to Vanessa that created a disparity in how they treated their daughters. My father's ultimatum had made clear that my place in the family was conditional on my willingness to enable dysfunction, rather than being based on mutual respect and equal treatment. The sale of the house was a logical consequence of their decision to weaponize property they no longer controlled. Under reasons against, I tried to honestly examine the arguments for why my action might be inappropriate or excessive. My parents were being forced to relocate on very short notice during a time of life when such upheaval could be particularly stressful and destabilizing. The sale would likely create financial hardship for them, as they tried to find new housing in an expensive rental market on their limited income. I was permanently damaging family relationships that might be irreparable regardless of whether reconciliation might be possible in the future. My action could be perceived as vindictive revenge, rather than legitimate boundary enforcement. The severity of the consequence might be disproportionate to the offense of my father's ultimatum. I studied both columns for a long time, reading and rereading each point, testing each argument against my internal sense of what was true and fair and necessary. The reasons against column represented perspectives I knew I would hear from others, concerns that had legitimacy and deserved consideration. But as I sat with them, I realized that most of these concerns assumed that I bore responsibility for protecting my parents from the consequences of their own choices, which was exactly the dynamic I was trying to break. My parents had chosen to refinance their house through me, which meant accepting the legal reality that I would become the primary owner. They had chosen to threaten to exclude me from the house in an attempt to force my compliance with their demands. They had chosen to ignore my concerns about Vanessa's pattern of poor decisions, while expecting me to apologize for voicing those concerns. They had chosen, through decades of behavior, to create a family system where my role was to be the strong one, who needed nothing, while Vanessa's role was to be the vulnerable one who needed everything. Each of these had been their choice, not mine. The consequences flowing from those choices were uncomfortable, but that did not make them unjust. I thought about a conversation I had once had with my supervisor at work, a woman named Patricia Liu, who had been in construction management for 25 years, and had mentored me significantly as I developed in my career. We had been discussing a difficult situation with a subcontractor who had consistently missed deadlines and exceeded budgets while making elaborate excuses and promising that the next phase would be different. I had been hesitant to terminate the contract because I knew it would create hardship for the subcontractor's workers and might delay the overall project timeline while we brought in a replacement. Patricia had listened to my concerns and then had said something that had stayed with me. "Rebecca, compassion is important, and considering the impact of your decisions on other people is a sign of good character. But you cannot protect people from the consequences of their own choices indefinitely. At some point, allowing someone to avoid consequences becomes enabling, and enabling ultimately harms everyone involved, including the person you think you are helping. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is enforce boundaries clearly and consistently so that people understand what is and is not acceptable. It might feel harsh in the moment, but it is actually the foundation for any healthy relationship or functional system." I had terminated that subcontractor's contract the following week, and while it had been uncomfortable and had required significant work to bring in a replacement, the project had ultimately been completed more successfully than it would have been if I had continued accommodating poor performance. The subcontractor had been angry, and had threatened legal action, and had told everyone in the industry that I was unreasonable and impossible to work with. But the project had come in under budget and ahead of schedule with the new subcontractor, and I had learned that sometimes doing the right thing professionally meant accepting that some people would view you negatively. The same principle applied here. My parents had performed poorly in their role as parents to me, not by being actively abusive, but by creating a system of disparate treatment and conditional acceptance that had required me to suppress my own needs and perspectives to maintain family harmony. They had consistently prioritized Vanessa's emotional comfort over truth or accountability. They had used whatever leverage they possessed, including the house, to try to force my compliance when I finally refused to continue participating in dysfunction. Enforcing consequences for that behavior was not vindictive. It was necessary. I closed the notebook and picked up my phone, finally opening the messages I had been avoiding. My mother's texts progressed through several emotional stages. The first few were panicked and pleading, begging me to reconsider and asking how I could do this to them. The middle messages were angry, accusing me of being cruel and selfish and destroying the family over a disagreement. The final messages were manipulative, telling me that my father had chest pains and she was worried about his heart, that this stress could kill him, that I would have to live with that guilt if something happened to him. My father's messages were shorter and more threatening. The first one said simply that I had made a serious mistake, and I needed to correct it immediately. The second one informed me that he had contacted an attorney and would be fighting the sale. The third one told me that I was no longer his daughter, and that he would make sure everyone in the family knew what kind of person I really was. Vanessa's messages were the most emotionally raw. She called me a psychopath and a monster. She said I had always been jealous of her, and that this was my way of punishing Mom and Dad for loving her more. She said I was destroying their lives because I was miserable and alone and wanted everyone else to be miserable too. She said she hoped I was happy now that I had gotten my revenge. She said she never wanted to speak to me again and that I was dead to her. I read through all the messages twice, looking for any indication that anyone in my family had stopped to consider their role in creating this situation, or had any understanding of why I might have felt that selling the house was a necessary response to how I had been treated. There was nothing. Every message operated from the assumption that I was the aggressor, that my action was unprovoked, that the problem was my vindictiveness rather than the decades of dysfunction that had led to this moment. I drafted several potential responses in my mind, ranging from detailed explanations of my reasoning to simple statements of my position to angry rebuttals of their characterizations. But ultimately I deleted all the messages without responding. Anything I said right now would be used as ammunition, taken out of context, and shared with extended family members as evidence of my unreasonableness. My parents and sister were not in a space to hear or understand my perspective, and I was not obligated to defend myself to people who had already decided I was the villain of this story. Instead, I opened a new document on my laptop and began writing something I had never written before. A clear statement of my boundaries and expectations going forward. This document was not for my family but for myself, a kind of contract I was making with my own values about what I would and would not accept in relationships. Writing it would help me stay grounded when the pressure to back down or compromise became intense, which I knew it would. I titled the document Boundaries and Principles and began typing. First, I would not apologize for actions that were appropriate and necessary simply to maintain relationships with people who did not respect me. This meant I would not apologize to Vanessa for asking legitimate questions about her wedding finances, and I would not apologize to my parents for selling a house that I owned legally. If apologies were required for reconciliation, then reconciliation would not happen because I would not compromise my integrity to purchase approval from people who should offer it freely. Second, I would not participate in relationships characterized by disparate treatment or conditional acceptance. This meant that any future relationship with my parents would require them to acknowledge the pattern of treating me differently from Vanessa, and to commit to equal treatment going forward. Anything less than that would not be acceptable, and I would maintain distance rather than continuing to participate in dysfunction. Third, I would not provide financial or practical support to people who had demonstrated that they would use that support as leverage against me, or who would not reciprocate support when I needed it. This meant that my parents would not receive any financial assistance from me going forward, regardless of their circumstances, because they had proven that they would weaponize my assistance rather than viewing it as the gift it was. Fourth, I would not allow family members to involve me in drama, or to use me as a mediator or peacekeeper in conflicts I did not create. This meant that if extended family members contacted me to express opinions about this situation, or to pressure me to reconcile on terms I did not accept, I would establish clear boundaries with them as well. I was done being the person who absorbed everyone else's discomfort to maintain family harmony. Fifth, I would build my life around relationships that were reciprocal, respectful, and based on mutual care rather than obligation or guilt. This meant investing my time and energy in friendships and potentially romantic relationships where I was valued, as I actually was, rather than trying to earn love from people who had made clear that their love was conditional on my compliance with their expectations. As I wrote these principles, I felt something shift inside me. These were not reactive statements born of anger or hurt, though both of those emotions were present. These were proactive commitments based on clarity about what I deserved and what I was willing to accept. For the first time in my life, I was defining the terms of my own participation in relationships rather than accepting whatever terms others offered and trying to make them work. My phone rang again and I saw my Aunt Linda's name on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later she called again. Then a text message appeared. "Rebecca, please call me. Your parents told me what happened and I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding. I am sure we can work this out if we all just talk calmly." I knew what this conversation would involve. My aunt would position herself as a neutral mediator trying to help everyone find common ground. She would acknowledge that perhaps my parents had not handled things perfectly but would emphasize that they meant well and were doing their best. She would suggest that I had perhaps overreacted, understandably given that I was hurt, but that the adult thing to do now would be to step back from the extreme position I had taken and find a compromise that allowed everyone to save face. She would appeal to family loyalty and shared history, and the importance of forgiveness. I had heard versions of this speech from various family members throughout my life whenever there had been conflicts between me and Vanessa or between me and my parents. The script was always the same. Acknowledge everyone's feelings, emphasize good intentions, encourage compromise, preserve family unity. What the script never included was any serious examination of the underlying patterns that kept creating these conflicts or any expectation that the people whose behavior had created the problem would actually change that behavior rather than simply having it excused and forgotten. I typed a response to my aunt. "I appreciate your concern, but this is not a misunderstanding and there is nothing to work out. I have made a decision based on clear principles and I am comfortable with that decision. Please do not contact me again about this matter. I am not interested in mediation or family discussions about my choices." I sent the message before I could second-guess myself. Almost immediately, my phone lit up with a call from my aunt again. I declined it and turned on Do Not Disturb mode, allowing calls only from my emergency contacts list, which included only my closest friend from work and my direct supervisor. Everyone else could leave voicemails that I would check when I was ready to deal with them. The apartment was very quiet now. I made myself a simple dinner of pasta with vegetables, ate it at the dining table while reading a book I had been working through about organizational leadership, and then did my evening routine of cleaning the kitchen and preparing my clothes for work the next day. The normalcy of these activities was grounding, a reminder that my life continued functioning regardless of the chaos I had created in my family system. Before going to bed, I checked my email and found a message from Diana Torres, my real estate agent. The subject line read, "Buyer inspection scheduled and updates." I opened it and read that the buyers had scheduled their walkthrough inspection for 2 days from now at 10 in the morning. Diana noted that she had copied my parents' email address on the message to ensure they were aware that they would need to provide access to the property. She also confirmed that all the paperwork was proceeding smoothly, and that the title company had everything they needed from me. The closing was still on schedule for exactly 2 weeks from today. I forwarded the email to my work account so I would remember to block out time on my calendar for the closing appointment. Then I drafted a brief response to Diana thanking her for the update and confirming that I would be available for any additional signatures or documents she needed. I kept the tone professional and matter-of-fact, because this was a business transaction regardless of the emotional weight it carried in my family relationships. As I lay in bed that night, waiting for sleep to come, I thought about the question my mother had asked. How could I do this to them? The question assumed that I was doing something to them, that I was the actor and they were the passive recipients of my actions. But that framing erased their agency and their choices. They had done things to me through decades of disparate treatment and conditional acceptance. They had done something to me when my father issued his ultimatum. I was simply responding to what had been done to me, using the resources and authority I possessed to establish boundaries they had proven they would not respect voluntarily. I did not feel guilty. I felt clear. Clarity, I was discovering, was a powerful antidote to the anxiety and guilt that had characterized so much of my relationship with my family. When you knew exactly what your principles were and you acted in alignment with those principles, there was a kind of peace that came with that alignment even when the actions themselves were difficult or painful. I fell asleep thinking about Patricia Liu's words about consequences and enabling. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is enforce boundaries clearly and consistently. I had spent 31 years failing to enforce boundaries with my family, accommodating their dysfunction, absorbing their disrespect, and wondering why I felt perpetually undervalued and overlooked. I was done with that pattern. Whatever came next would be built on a foundation of self-respect and clear boundaries, or it would not be built at all. The last thought I had before sleep claimed me was that I had no idea what my life would look like on the other side of this decision, but I knew with absolute certainty that it would be better than what I was leaving behind. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that follows a night of deep, dreamless sleep. I woke at 6:30 as usual, went through my morning routine of showering and dressing in the business casual attire I wore to construction sites, and made coffee while checking my work email on my laptop. There were 3 new project updates that required my attention, a scheduling conflict that needed resolution, and a budget variance report that I would need to review before the afternoon meeting with our client. The familiar rhythm of work responsibilities was steadying, a reminder that I had built a professional life that was entirely separate from my family drama, and that continued to function regardless of what chaos existed in my personal relationships. I left my apartment at 7:45 to beat the worst of the morning traffic and arrived at the office by 8:15. Our company occupied the 3rd floor of a renovated warehouse building in the industrial district of Southeast Portland, with exposed brick walls and high ceilings and large windows that overlooked the city. My desk was in a shared space with 5 other project coordinators, each of us responsible for managing different aspects of the various commercial construction projects the company had underway at any given time. My closest colleague, Sarah Brennan, was already at her desk when I arrived, reviewing blueprints with a contractor over a video call. She waved at me as I settled into my workspace, and I waved back, grateful that she was occupied and would not immediately ask about my weekend or notice anything unusual in my demeanor. I needed a few hours of normal work routine before I would be ready to discuss what had happened with anyone. I spent the morning focused entirely on work tasks, responding to emails from subcontractors, reviewing updated timelines for a mixed-use development project in Beaverton, and preparing materials for the afternoon client meeting. The work was consuming in the best way, requiring enough mental engagement that I could not simultaneously worry about my family situation. By the time lunch arrived, I had made significant progress on several outstanding issues, and felt the satisfaction that always came with productive work. Sarah stopped by my desk as I was finishing a conference call about material delivery schedules. She had a sandwich from the deli down the street and was eating at her desk rather than going to the break room, which usually meant she wanted to talk about something. I saved the document I had been working on and turned to face her, anticipating that she had noticed something was different about my mood or energy. "You seem very focused today," she said, taking a bite of her sandwich. "Like intensely focused even for you. Everything okay?" Sarah and I had worked together for 3 years, and had developed the kind of friendship that existed primarily within the boundaries of professional life, but occasionally extended into personal territory when one of us needed support or perspective. She was 42 years old, divorced with 2 teenage children, and possessed a direct communication style that I appreciated because it meant she asked clear questions rather than dancing around topics she was curious about. "I had a significant family conflict over the weekend," I said, deciding that some version of honesty was better than pretending everything was fine. "It is resolved now in the sense that I took definitive action, but the fallout is going to be complicated. I am using work as a productive distraction while I process everything." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression shifting from casual curiosity to genuine concern. "Do you want to talk about it? Or do you want me to leave you alone, and just be available if you decide you want to talk later?" This was why I valued Sarah's friendship. She understood boundaries and respected autonomy, while also making clear that support was available if needed. I considered her question carefully, weighing the relief that might come from talking through the situation with someone who had no stake in it against the risk of opening emotional floodgates that might be difficult to close again while I was still at work. "I think I want to talk about it," I said finally, "but maybe not right this minute. Could we grab coffee after work? I have that client meeting at 2 and I need to stay focused on that, but afterward I could use some outside perspective from someone who is not involved in the situation." "Absolutely. There is that coffee place on Division that stays open late. We could meet there around 5:30 if that works for you." "That would be perfect. Thank you." Sarah finished her sandwich and returned to her own desk, and I spent the next hour preparing for the client meeting with renewed focus. The meeting itself went well, with the client expressing satisfaction with our progress on their retail development project, and approving the change orders we had proposed to address some unexpected site conditions. By the time the meeting concluded at 3:30, I felt confident that we were on track to complete the project within the revised timeline and budget parameters. I spent the next hour finishing administrative tasks and responding to emails, and then I gathered my things and told Sarah I would meet her at the coffee shop. The drive across town took 20 minutes in late afternoon traffic, and I used the time to mentally prepare for the conversation I was about to have. I had not yet told anyone outside my family what I had done, and articulating it to someone whose opinion I respected would be its own kind of test. If Sarah, who was reasonable and balanced and had no reason to take sides, thought I had gone too far, then perhaps I needed to reconsider my position. The coffee shop was a locally owned establishment with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, the kind of place that attracted freelancers working on laptops and students studying for exams. Sarah had already secured a corner table away from the main flow of traffic, and she had ordered for both of us, knowing I took my coffee black with no sugar. I sat down across from her and wrapped my hands around the warm cup, appreciating the simple comfort of a familiar beverage in a quiet space. "So," Sarah said, setting down her own cup and looking at me with a kind of direct attention that made clear she was fully present for this conversation. "Tell me what happened." I took a breath and began with the engagement dinner, explaining the context of Vanessa's relationship history and Marcus's pattern of enthusiasm without follow-through. I described asking questions about their financial plans and the reaction that had followed, the accusations of jealousy and cruelty, the way my parents had immediately sided with Vanessa and demanded an apology. I explained my father's ultimatum, the choice he had presented between apologizing or leaving the house and not coming back until I was ready to be part of the family on their terms. Then I explained about the house itself, the refinancing arrangement from 8 months earlier, the legal structure that had made me the primary owner, and my decision to sell the property rather than accept my father's terms. I described informing my parents of the sale and their reactions, the messages I had received from family members, and my decision to maintain firm boundaries rather than engaging in negotiations or compromises that would require me to back down from my position. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful and neutral. When I finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, apparently processing everything I had told her. I waited, recognizing that she was formulating her response carefully rather than reacting immediately. "Okay," she said finally. "I want to make sure I understand the sequence correctly because the legal piece is important. Your parents came to you 8 months ago asking for help refinancing their house because their credit was not good enough to get favorable rates on their own. You agreed to become the primary owner and take on the mortgage responsibility in order to help them access better terms. They have been making the payments as agreed, so there has been no default or financial problem with the arrangement. Is that all accurate so far?" "Yes, that is all accurate." "And then 3 days ago, your father issued an ultimatum saying you had to apologize to your sister, or you could not come back to the house until you were ready to be part of the family on his terms. He used access to the house as leverage to try to force your compliance with his demand, and your response was to exercise your legal authority as primary owner to sell the house, which you have the right to do even though it forces your parents to relocate on short notice. Is that also accurate?" "Yes, that is accurate." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, her eyes focused on something in the middle distance as she thought through the implications. "From a purely legal standpoint, you are completely within your rights. You own the property and have the authority to sell it. Your parents have benefited from the refinancing arrangement without fulfilling any obligations beyond making the monthly payments, and they have no legal standing to prevent you from selling. So legally, you are on solid ground." I felt a small release of tension I had not realized I was holding. The legal validation mattered because it meant my action had a foundation beyond emotion or impulse. From a practical standpoint, Sarah continued, "Your father made a strategic error by threatening to exclude you from a property he no longer controlled. He tried to use leverage he did not actually possess, which is always a risky move in any negotiation. You called his bluff in a way he did not anticipate, and now he is dealing with consequences he did not think were possible. Again, from a strategic perspective, your response was logical given the circumstances." She paused, setting down her coffee cup and meeting my eyes directly. "From an emotional and relational standpoint, this is obviously much more complicated. You have permanently altered your relationship with your parents, and likely with your sister, and potentially with other family members who take sides in this conflict. That is a significant cost, even if it is a cost you are willing to pay. The question I would ask you is whether you believe this cost is justified by what you gain, which is primarily the enforcement of boundaries and the refusal to accept conditional family membership. I had been thinking about exactly this question since the previous night. What did I gain by selling the house that justified the destruction of family relationships? The answer, when I examined it honestly, was not primarily about the house itself or even about the money that would result from the sale. The answer was about establishing clearly and irrevocably that I would not accept being treated as lesser than, that I would not absorb disrespect to maintain relationships with people who did not value me, that I would not compromise my integrity to purchase approval from those who should offer it freely. I believe the cost is justified, I said slowly, working through my reasoning as I spoke. My relationship with my parents has never been healthy or reciprocal. I have spent my entire adult life trying to earn respect and recognition that they gave freely to my sister regardless of whether she deserved it. They have treated me as though my strength meant I did not need care or support, while treating Vanessa as though her vulnerability meant she deserved unlimited accommodation. That pattern was never going to change through conversations or gentle boundary setting, because I had tried those approaches for years without success. The only thing that was going to change the dynamic was action significant enough that they could not ignore it or minimize it. Selling the house is that action. Sarah nodded, her expression understanding but not necessarily agreeing. I hear what you are saying, and I do not think you are wrong about the pattern or about the fact that gentle approaches were not working. But I want to push back on one aspect of your reasoning, not because I think you should change your decision but because I think you should be clear-eyed about what this decision represents. Please push back. I want to hear your perspective even if it challenges mine. You are framing this as enforcing boundaries and refusing to accept conditional family membership, which is how you genuinely experience it. But from your parents' perspective, and from the perspective of anyone who hears their version of events, this is going to look like vindictive retaliation. They are going to tell people that they asked you to apologize for hurting your sister's feelings, which sounds like a reasonable parental request, and your response was to kick them out of their home with almost no notice. That narrative makes you look extremely unreasonable, and you need to be prepared for the fact that most people who hear it are going to side with your parents. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. I had been so focused on my own perspective and on the justification for my actions based on decades of context that I had not fully considered how the situation would be presented by my parents to others or how that presentation would shape perceptions of who was reasonable and who was vindictive. You are right, I said. I had not thought through the public relations aspect of this as carefully as I should have. Most people are not going to hear about the 31 years of disparate treatment or the pattern of conditional acceptance. They are going to hear that my father asked me to apologize and I responded by selling his house. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her expression serious but not unsympathetic. So the question becomes whether you are comfortable being perceived as the villain in this story, at least by people who only hear your parents' version of events. Because that is almost certainly what is going to happen. Your extended family, your parents' friends, probably even some mutual acquaintances are going to hear a narrative that makes you look terrible, and most of them are not going to seek out your side of the story before forming their opinions. I thought about this for a long moment, testing my emotional response to the idea of being widely perceived as vindictive or cruel. The prospect was uncomfortable, certainly. I had spent my life trying to be reasonable and responsible, trying to earn respect through good behavior and strong performance. The idea that people would view me as someone who had acted out of spite or vindictiveness was difficult to accept. But as I sat with the discomfort, I realized something important. The opinions of people who did not know me well enough to understand the full context of my decision were ultimately not very important. If extended family members or my parents' friends wanted to form judgments based on incomplete information that reflected their own willingness to make assumptions rather than seek understanding, I could not control what narratives my parents chose to tell, or how other people chose to interpret those narratives. I could only control my own actions and my own integrity. I am comfortable being perceived as the villain by people who do not know the full story, I said finally, because the people whose opinions actually matter to me, the people who know me well enough to understand my character, are going to ask questions and seek context before forming judgments. And those are the relationships worth maintaining anyway. Sarah smiled slightly, her expression that suggested approval even if not complete agreement. That is probably the healthiest response you could have to this situation. As long as you are genuinely comfortable with that position and not just telling yourself you are comfortable because you think you should be. I am genuinely comfortable with it. Or at least I am as comfortable as I can be right now. I might feel differently when the actual social consequences start manifesting, but I do not think I am going to regret the decision itself regardless of how other people react to it. Then I think you have done what you needed to do, even though it is difficult and even though the fallout is going to be painful. Sometimes establishing boundaries requires you to accept being misunderstood or mischaracterized by people who are not willing to see your perspective. That is part of the cost of protecting yourself from relationships that are harmful. We talked for another 30 minutes about practical considerations and emotional processing strategies. Sarah shared some of her own experiences navigating difficult family dynamics during her divorce, when her ex-husband's family had painted her as unreasonable and demanding while ignoring his patterns of irresponsibility and infidelity. She talked about the initial pain of being excluded from family gatherings and hearing secondhand about the negative things being said about her, and then the eventual relief of realizing that she was better off without relationships that were based on her willingness to accept mistreatment. The conversation was exactly what I needed, combining validation of my decision with clear-eyed acknowledgement of the challenges ahead. By the time we finished our coffee and prepared to leave, I felt more grounded and more confident that I was on the right path, even if that path was difficult and lonely at times. As I drove home that evening, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I answered it cautiously, and a woman's voice introduced herself as Jennifer Martinez from the title company, handling the sale of my parents' house. She explained that she was calling to confirm some information for the closing documents, and to let me know that she had received an inquiry from an attorney representing my parents. An attorney contacted you? I asked, feeling my stomach tighten slightly despite my intellectual certainty that my parents had no legal standing to stop the sale. Yes, a Thomas Garrett from Garrett & Associates. He sent a letter stating that he represents Donald and Marie Chan, who are secondary owners of the property at the address in question. He claimed that the sale was initiated without their knowledge or consent and requested that we halt the closing process pending a review of the ownership documents and the circumstances of the sale. I took a breath, forcing myself to remain calm and professional. The ownership documents are clear. I am the primary owner with full authority to sell the property. Donald and Marie Chan are secondary owners with right of occupancy, but without authority to prevent or halt a sale initiated by the primary owner. I have copies of all the refinancing documents that establish this ownership structure, and I am happy to provide them to you again if needed. We have all the documents we need, and our legal team has reviewed them thoroughly. The ownership structure is exactly as you described. I am calling primarily to inform you that we received the inquiry, and to let you know that we responded to the attorney explaining that the sale is proceeding as scheduled, because the primary owner has full authority to initiate and complete the sale. I wanted to make sure you were aware that your parents have legal representation and that they are attempting to stop the sale, even though that attempt is unlikely to be successful. I appreciate you informing me. Is there anything I need to do in response to their attorney's inquiry? Not at this time. We have handled the response on your behalf as part of our standard process for clarifying title issues. If the attorney escalates the matter or if your parents attempt to physically interfere with the buyer's inspection or the closing process, we may need to pursue additional legal remedies, but for now everything is proceeding normally. The inspection is still scheduled for tomorrow at 10 in the morning, and the closing is still scheduled for 2 weeks from yesterday. Thank you for the update. Please let me know if anything changes or if you need anything additional from me. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for several minutes, processing this new development. My father had followed through on his threat to hire an attorney, which meant he was taking this seriously and was willing to spend money on legal fees even though he had been clearly informed that he had no legal standing to prevent the sale. This was both predictable and frustrating. Another example of him refusing to accept reality and consequences because he was accustomed to getting his way through force of will and patriarchal authority. But the title company had handled it appropriately, and the sale was continuing as planned. My parents' attorney had been informed of the legal facts and presumably had advised them that they had no viable path to stopping the sale. Whether they would accept that advice or continue to pursue futile legal challenges remained to be seen, but either way, I was confident that the law was on my side and that the property would close as scheduled. I went up to my apartment and made myself dinner, then spent the evening reviewing the documents from the refinancing one more time to ensure I had not missed anything that might give my parents an opening to challenge the sale. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The documents clearly established me as the primary owner with full authority over the property. My parents had signed those documents voluntarily after being advised to consult with their own attorney if they had questions about the terms. There was no ambiguity and no grounds for challenge beyond the emotional argument that they had not expected me to actually exercise the authority they had given me. Before bed, I checked my phone and found several new messages. My mother had sent a long email rather than a text, apparently deciding that a different medium might be more effective. The email was a detailed recounting of my childhood, emphasizing all the sacrifices she and my father had made to provide for Vanessa and me, all the ways they had supported us and loved us and tried to be good parents. She described the financial struggles they had faced when we were young, the way they had gone without things they wanted so that we could have what we needed, the countless hours they had spent at school events and sports activities and family dinners trying to create a loving home for their daughters. The email ended with a plea that combined guilt and desperation. After everything we gave you, after all the years of loving you and supporting you and being proud of you, this is how you repay us? By throwing us out of our home because we asked you to apologize to your sister? How can you be so cold? How can you not see that you are destroying our lives over something so trivial? Please, Rebecca. Please reconsider this before it is too late. We are your parents. We love you. Do not do this to us. I read the email twice, examining my emotional response to it. There was guilt, certainly, because the recounting of their sacrifices was not entirely inaccurate even if it was selective in what it emphasized and what it ignored. There was sadness because the relationship I had with my parents was genuinely ending, not just in the immediate crisis but in any form that resembled what families were supposed to be. There was anger because even in this plea, my mother could not acknowledge the pattern of disparate treatment or consider that perhaps my response was proportionate to decades of accumulated disrespect. But underneath all of those emotions was a layer of clarity that felt unshakable. My mother was asking me to reconsider based on the argument that parents deserved obedience and accommodation from their children regardless of how they treated those children. She was arguing that providing the basics of food and shelter and attending school events constituted such extraordinary sacrifice that I owed them compliance with their demands even when those demands required me to compromise my integrity and enable dysfunction. She was framing their ultimatum as trivial while framing my response as catastrophic, without recognizing that both actions existed on the same scale of severity. I did not respond to the email. There was nothing I could say that would help my mother understand my perspective, because understanding my perspective would require her to acknowledge patterns of behavior she had participated in creating and maintaining for decades. People rarely develop that kind of insight under pressure, and I was not going to waste my energy trying to force awareness that would only come, if it came at all, through her own difficult internal work. Instead, I opened my document of boundaries and principles and added one more item. I would not engage in circular arguments with people who were not genuinely seeking understanding. This meant I would not respond to messages that were designed to manipulate or to assign blame rather than to communicate authentically. I would not defend my decisions to people who had already decided I was wrong. I would not participate in conversations where the premise was that I needed to justify my boundaries or prove that my perspective was valid. I saved the document and closed my laptop. Tomorrow the buyers would do their inspection of the house, which meant my parents would be confronted with the physical reality of the sale proceeding. The title company had handled the legal challenge. My principles were clear and my boundaries were established. All that remained was to hold steady while the consequences unfolded, and to trust that I had made the right decision, even when the pressure to back down became intense. I fell asleep that night thinking about something Sarah had said. Sometimes establishing boundaries requires you to accept being misunderstood. I was prepared to accept that. What I was not prepared to accept was a lifetime of participating in my own mistreatment to avoid the discomfort of being perceived negatively by people who did not matter. The morning of the buyer's inspection arrived with unseasonably warm weather for October in Portland, the kind of bright autumn day that made the city feel optimistic and alive. I had taken the morning off work, not to attend the inspection itself but to be available by phone in case any issues arose that required immediate decision-making. I spent the early hours at a coffee shop near my apartment, working remotely on project documents and responding to emails while keeping my phone volume turned up, so I would not miss any calls from Diana Torres or the title company. At precisely 10 o'clock, my phone rang with Diana's number. I answered immediately, expecting a routine update about the inspection beginning on schedule. Instead, Diana's voice carried a note of tension that put me on immediate alert. "Rebecca, we have a situation at the property. Your parents are refusing to allow the buyers and their inspector access to the house. They are saying that the sale is being disputed by their attorney, and that no inspection should proceed until the legal issues are resolved. I have explained to them multiple times that they do not have the authority to prevent the inspection, and that the legal structure of the ownership gives you full rights to sell, but they are not listening. They have physically blocked the front door, and are telling the buyers that if they attempt to enter the property, they will call the police for trespassing." I felt a surge of anger mixed with a kind of weary inevitability. Of course my parents were going to escalate. Of course they were going to attempt to sabotage the sale through obstruction since their legal challenge had failed. This was entirely consistent with their pattern of refusing to accept consequences, and expecting that their resistance would eventually wear down anyone who tried to hold them accountable. "I am going to call them right now and tell them they need to allow access immediately," I said to Diana. "If they continue to refuse after I speak with them, what are our options for proceeding?" Diana's voice became more businesslike, shifting into problem-solving mode. "If they continue to obstruct access after you have clearly instructed them to allow it, we can contact local law enforcement to explain the situation, and potentially have officers on site to ensure the inspection can proceed. You are the legal owner of the property with the right to grant access to potential buyers, and your parents are occupants who are interfering with your legal rights. The police would likely treat this as a civil matter initially, but if your parents absolutely refuse to cooperate, there could be grounds for a trespassing complaint against them, since they are preventing the rightful owner from exercising their property rights. Please give me 15 minutes to call them and attempt to resolve this without involving law enforcement. I will call you back shortly to let you know whether they agree to cooperate or whether we need to escalate." I hung up with Diana and immediately pulled up my father's number, which I had not blocked despite blocking my mother's and Vanessa's numbers because I had anticipated needing to communicate with him about practical matters related to the house. He answered on the second ring, his voice hard and cold in a way I had rarely heard directed at me. "What do you want, Rebecca?" "I want you to stop blocking the inspection of the house and allow the buyers and their inspector access immediately. You are interfering with the legal sale of property that I own, and if you continue to obstruct, I will have no choice but to involve law enforcement to ensure access is granted." My father laughed, a bitter sound that carried no humor whatsoever. "You think you can threaten me with the police? This is my home, Rebecca. I have lived here for 35 years. I am not going to stand aside and let strangers walk through my house, as if they already own it when this entire sale is happening against my will, and without my consent. The sale does not require your consent. I am the primary owner with full authority to sell this property. You signed documents last March that gave me that authority because it was the only way you could refinance at rates you could afford. Those documents are legally binding. Your attorney has already been informed by the title company that you have no grounds to stop this sale. You are wasting everyone's time and making this situation worse by attempting to obstruct a process that is going to happen regardless of your cooperation." I heard my mother's voice in the background, too muffled to make out the words but loud enough to indicate she was nearby and participating in whatever strategy they had decided to employ. My father's voice when he spoke again was even harder than before. "You have given us 15 days to find somewhere else to live. 15 days after living in this house for more than 3 decades. Do you have any idea how impossible that timeline is? We cannot find an apartment that quickly. We cannot afford the kind of places that are available on short notice. You are forcing us into homelessness because we asked you to apologize to your sister. That is insane, Rebecca. That is cruel and vindictive and completely disproportionate to anything we did to you." I took a breath, forcing myself to remain calm, and not be drawn into an emotional argument about proportionality or cruelty. "You have had 3 days since I informed you of the sale to begin looking for housing. If you had started that process immediately instead of hiring an attorney to pursue a legal challenge that had no merit, you would be 3 days further along in finding a new place. The timeline is not my fault. It is the consequence of your decision to try to fight this sale instead of accepting it and planning accordingly. We should not have to accept it at all. This is our house. We raised our children here. We have memories and history and a life built in this space. You cannot just erase all of that because you are angry about a family disagreement. The house became mine the moment you signed the refinancing documents, making me the primary owner. You were advised at that time to consult with an attorney if you had questions about what you were agreeing to. You chose to proceed without that consultation because you trusted that the arrangement was what you needed it to be to get better interest rates. That trust was not misplaced at the time because I had no intention of selling the house when we did the refinancing. But circumstances changed when you decided to use the house as leverage against me. You weaponized property you did not control, and now you are experiencing the consequences of that strategic error. My father's voice rose in volume, the control he had been maintaining beginning to slip. You keep talking about consequences and leverage like this is some kind of business negotiation instead of a family. We are your parents, Rebecca. Family does not treat each other this way. Family forgives and compromises and finds ways to work through disagreements without destroying each other's lives. Family also does not treat their children with disparate standards and conditional acceptance. Family does not demand apologies for reasonable behavior, while excusing unreasonable behavior in other family members. Family does not issue ultimatums designed to force compliance through emotional manipulation. You established the terms of our relationship when you told me to leave your house and not come back until I was willing to participate on your terms. I am simply accepting those terms and removing myself from a family system that has never valued me equally. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When my father spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming quieter but somehow more menacing. If you go through with this sale, you will never be part of this family again. Your mother and I will not forgive you. Vanessa will not forgive you. You will be completely alone, Rebecca. Is that really what you want? To destroy every relationship you have ever had because you are too stubborn to admit when you are wrong? The threat was designed to exploit what my father perceived as my greatest vulnerability, the fear of isolation and abandonment that he assumed would override my commitment to my boundaries. He was operating from the assumption that I needed the family more than the family needed me, that my identity was so wrapped up in being their daughter that the prospect of permanent estrangement would terrify me into backing down. But as I listened to his words, I felt something unexpected. Not fear but relief. Relief that the subtext was finally becoming text, that the implicit threat that had always hung over our relationship was being stated explicitly. For my entire life, my place in the family had been conditional on my willingness to absorb whatever treatment was offered, and to maintain harmony regardless of how that maintenance affected my well-being. My father was now saying out loud what had always been true beneath the surface. If I prioritized my own boundaries and dignity over their comfort and control, I would be expelled from the family. He thought he was issuing a threat, but he was actually offering me clarity. I have already accepted that outcome, I said, my voice steady and clear. You are not threatening me with something I fear. You are describing a consequence I have consciously chosen. I would rather be alone with my integrity intact than be part of a family that requires me to compromise my values and accept mistreatment to maintain membership. So yes, if those are the terms, then I choose to be alone. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear my mother saying something in the background, her voice rising in pitch with what sounded like panic or distress. My father cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted once more, taking on a tone I recognized as his attempt at reason and authority combined. Rebecca, your mother is very upset. She did not sleep at all last night. She is having heart palpitations from the stress. If something happens to her because of this situation, that will be on you. Is that really what you want? To be responsible for your mother's health crisis, because you refuse to show basic human decency and compassion? The manipulation was transparent but still effective at triggering a flash of guilt and concern. My mother did have a history of anxiety-related heart palpitations, and the stress of this situation was undoubtedly real. But the framing that I would be responsible for her health issues was designed to shift accountability away from the choices she and my father had made, and onto my refusal to absorb the consequences of those choices. Mom's health is important and I genuinely hope she is okay. But her stress is the result of choices you both made, not choices I made. You could reduce her stress immediately by accepting the reality of the sale, and focusing your energy on finding new housing instead of trying to fight a battle you cannot win. That is within your control. What is not within your control is my decision to enforce boundaries and protect myself from further mistreatment. So you are just going to let your mother suffer because you are too proud to back down? I am going to maintain boundaries that are necessary for my well-being regardless of how uncomfortable that makes other people. That is not the same as wanting anyone to suffer. It is simply recognizing that I am not responsible for managing everyone else's emotional reactions to consequences they created. My father made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a sigh of frustration. Fine. We will let your inspection proceed. But know that we are doing this under protest, and that we consider this entire situation to be an abuse of power on your part. You have taken advantage of a legal technicality to destroy our security and our home, because you could not handle being asked to apologize. That says everything anyone needs to know about your character. The inspection will begin in approximately 10 minutes. Thank you for cooperating, even if that cooperation is grudging. I hung up before he could respond, not wanting to continue a conversation that had already covered all the territory that mattered. I immediately called Diana back and informed her that my parents had agreed to allow access to the property, and that the inspection could proceed. Diana sounded relieved and said she would inform the buyers immediately. She also mentioned that she would stay on site for the duration of the inspection to ensure there were no further issues or attempts at interference. The rest of the morning passed slowly as I waited for updates about the inspection. I tried to focus on work tasks but found my concentration fragmenting, my mind returning repeatedly to the conversation with my father and the various manipulation tactics he had deployed. The threat of permanent estrangement, the exploitation of my mother's health issues, the characterization of my action as an abuse of power rather than an enforcement of boundaries. Each tactic was designed to trigger guilt or fear or self-doubt, and while I had not given in to any of them, they had still landed with enough force to be unsettling. Diana called back around 1 in the afternoon to report that the inspection had been completed without further interference from my parents. The inspector had identified a few minor issues related to routine maintenance, but nothing that would affect the buyer's willingness to proceed with the purchase. The buyers remained committed to the sale and were satisfied with the property's condition. The closing was still on track for the original scheduled date. I thanked Diana for managing the situation professionally and asked her to keep me updated on any further developments. After hanging up, I sat in the coffee shop for a long moment, staring at my laptop screen without seeing the words displayed there. A significant hurdle had been cleared. The inspection was complete. The legal challenge had been dismissed. The closing would proceed. My parents had tried to stop the process and had failed, which meant they would now need to confront the reality that they actually were going to lose the house and would need to find somewhere else to live. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I opened it cautiously and found a long message from Vanessa that began with her identifying herself in case I had blocked her original number. The message was a stream of consciousness rant that combined accusations, insults, and emotional manipulation in roughly equal measure. She called me a heartless monster who was destroying our parents' lives, because I was jealous that they loved her more than they loved me. She said I had always been cold and calculating and that this was just the latest example of me caring more about being right than about actual human relationships. She said Marcus was appalled by my behavior, and had told her he was glad he would never have to see me again after this. She said I was going to end up completely alone because no one wanted to be around someone as selfish and vindictive as I was. She said Mom was having chest pains and might need to go to the hospital and that if anything happened to her, it would be my fault for causing this stress. She said Dad's blood pressure was dangerously high, and his doctor was concerned about the risk of stroke. She said I was killing our parents slowly through my cruelty, and that I would have to live with that guilt for the rest of my life. The message ended with a final accusatory question. How does it feel to know that everyone in our family hates you now? How does it feel to know that you have burned every bridge and destroyed every relationship, because you could not just swallow your pride and say you were sorry? I hope whatever satisfaction you are getting from this is worth being completely alone forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.